I assume that most of you followed the release of the new enlargement package by the European Commission last week, which also includes a communication on a European investment plan, the new instrument under IPA 3, which foresees 9 billion euros of investment-related assistance to the region for the next 7-year budgetary cycle. As expected, this instrument makes a direct linkage between the allocation of funds with the country's performance on the good governance and the rule of law. In today's discussion, we will shed light on this plan and overall on the EU's approach to helping the region catch up with the EU in economic terms. And we will discuss ideas how to make the best of the existing instruments. In other words, we will try to contribute to answering to the underlying question of how to reconcile the necessity for the economic boost of the region with the weak governance and administrative capacities of the region. And can the EU financial assistance act as an incentive for the political leadership in the region to take the rule of law reforms more seriously? And can we ensure that the citizens of the region benefit from the EU's assistance the most? To address these issues, I have a great pleasure of presenting you our panel for today. Mr. Alan Jones, head of the unit strategy in Turkey within the Directorate General of the European Commission for enlargement and neighborhood countries. Milena Lazarevic, Program Director of the European Policy Center, CEP Belgrade. Simonida Kacarska, Director of European Policy Institute in Skopje. Jerzy Wurmo from Institute for Democracy and Mediation in Albania, Tirana, and Wouter Zwiers, Research Fellow from the Clingendael Institute in the Netherlands. Following the panel discussion, we will dedicate the second half of the event to your comments and questions. If you have them, please feel free to use the Q&A option in Zoom, which you can find on the bottom right corner. And we will do our best to address them and incorporate them in our discussion. So we can start with the Commission representative, Alan Jones. Thank you once again for accepting to participate. We really think that it's very valuable to have a Commission's representative today, and in particular. The Commissioner for Enlargement, Oliver Varhelyi, recently declared in Belgrade that the EU's announced assistance has the potential to overturn the economic picture of the region. The expectations of this plan were set high already at the beginning of the year following the declaration in the Zagreb, after the Zagreb summit between the leaders of the Western Balkans and the EU. Could you give us a short introduction of this instrument and particularly focus on the conditionality, rule of law conditionality attached to this instrument?
Sure. Thanks very much for the introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to join in this event. It's of course a very timely event indeed, and it's a great opportunity for us to explain a little bit about what we have just come forward with as the European Commission last week. As you said in your introductory words, it is the enlargement package. It is a tradition that we have every year. We produce a communication on enlargement policy, how the policy is being implemented in the 7 countries covered by enlargement policy. And we have, of course, very detailed reports on each of the countries that go through all of the various areas that need to be addressed on the path towards the European Union. The great novelty this year was indeed the adoption of an economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans for the period ahead, which was, of course, much anticipated also with the communications that were produced by the Commission earlier this year. I think before saying a few words about the economic investment plan itself, I think it is worth just taking a step back and looking at the Commission's work on enlargement in general this year, and the new Commission's mandate and the 3 main tracks, I would say, for the Western Balkans that we are pursuing. I mean, first, there has been the effort to reinvigorate the enlargement process as such. And with that, in February, the Commission came forward with a revised enlargement methodology to try to inject more dynamism, more credibility, more political steer into the enlargement process. We also looked to the opening of accession negotiations with Albania and North Macedonia. It's well known that the Commission recommendations, in the case of North Macedonia, had been on the table for some time, with Albania for 2 years. And this was very important to be able to move forward and unblock the progress on this front. And that was then achieved with the decision of the member states in the spring. And currently, the Council, the member states are discussing draft negotiating frameworks for both countries. The third track has been, I think, this recognition of the need to support and accelerate economic convergence in the region. And this issue has been there, of course, for some time, but I think the COVID pandemic and situation has underlined very much the need for extra support here. Earlier in the year, there was emergency assistance that was provided by the Commission to the region to address the immediate needs of the COVID response in health terms, socio-economic terms, and so on. A 3.3 billion package was presented in the spring. But now we want to move much more to the, let's say, the longer term socio-economic recovery. And that's very much what is behind this economic and investment plan. I'll try to be brief, but I'm of course happy to answer questions and go into more detail a little bit later. But I mean, in essence, what we're trying to achieve is a boost to competitiveness, to growth, sustainable connectivity, underpinned by what we call the dual transition, green and digital, to bring the region closer to the European Union, to the single market, and unleash the undoubted economic potential that is there in the region. And we see also significant scope for regional economic cooperation, and the work ongoing to create a regional economic market, I think, is very, very important in this respect. And then I think it's also about encouraging reforms, and there we make the link to what remains at the heart of the accession process. That is what we call the fundamentals, the principle of fundamentals first. This is about rule of law, fighting corruption, respect for fundamental rights, public administration reform, economic reform more generally, and so on. I think this is really quite important because from our perspective, the success of this plan, I think, will be very much dependent on the success or otherwise of the reform implementation from a rule of law perspective, and of course also from an economic perspective as well. The proposal is to mobilize up to 9 billion euros of IPA 3 funding, as you mentioned at the start, for the next multi-annual financial framework, which covers 2021 to 2027. Of course, everything is subject still to the adoption of the next multi-annual financial framework. You'll be well aware that discussions are still ongoing here, both on the overall MFF, the overall budgetary resources that will be available, but also on the separate legal basis. So in our case, the instrument for pre-accession assistance. Another important dimension which is flagged there is not just the investment support itself, but also the effort to increase the investment capacity of the region as such, in particular through mobilizing a new Western Balkans guarantee facility. And with this facility, there is the ambition to potentially raise investments of up to 20 billion euros. The plan is setting out a number of what we call flagships, with about 40 or so projects identified already at this stage. What are we focusing on with this? Well, first, we're looking at sustainable transport. We're looking at infrastructure for economic development, connecting capitals, rail, road. We're looking at clean energy. The transition from coal, I think, is going to be extremely important in this respect. I think we're very well aware of the incidence of air pollution in the region of the Western Balkans, which I think is among the worst in Europe. And this has a real major impact on people's lives and on health outcomes. We're looking at environment concerns. We're looking at wastewater treatment, waste management. Ideas about looking at how to improve energy efficiency. There is huge scope. I mean, the number of emissions that come from inefficient buildings, for example, is very, very high. There we're calling it a renovation wave. We're looking at the digital future. This is, of course, part of this dual transition as well. Deployment of ultra-fast broadband, improving digital skills, looking at developing the private sector, continued and increased support when it comes to supporting small and medium-sized enterprises, and, of course, human capital development with a particular focus on youth. As I say, the ideas that are set out there it's the beginning. We have to see now that the overall structures, the MFF, the legal basis and so on are in place. The implementation of this plan will be very much dependent on the procedures that will be in place under the new IPA 3. There are a number of ideas there already, of course, on the table, which are being discussed by the co-legislators in terms of how we identify the needs, how we identify the capacities, and of course the importance of ensuring that there is a track record in implementing reforms, which will be absolutely, I think, essential for all of this to succeed, as I said before. Now, when it comes to reforms, the plan also indicates very clearly that good governance and the rule of law will be necessary for the plan to succeed. It's very clear that there will be continued support also in this field, as we have had under IPA 2 throughout the whole of the next period from 2021 to 2027. There are, in the IPA proposal, I won't go into the detail now, but it is structured around what we call windows. There are 5 windows of intervention. Windows 3 and 4, not to get too technical, this is covering the green agenda. This is covering sustainable connectivity, competitiveness and inclusive growth. This is where the core of the funding that is set out in this economic and investment plan will be supporting. But we also have windows on rule of law and good governance, including a key alignment, including working in terms of increasing the administrative capacity, institution building in the country, support the civil society and so on. So this will all continue to be covered. Now, when it comes to rule of law very specifically, I think the plan clearly cannot be seen in isolation from a number of things. I mean, one, the well-established principles of enlargement policy. This is about conditionality. This is about own merit. This is about the fundamentals first, as I mentioned before. It cannot be seen in isolation from the revised enlargement methodology from February, which I also mentioned. I mentioned some of the principles there already, in particular credibility. But what does that mean? Again, I can go into more detail if there is an interest from the audience on this. But this is about really strengthening the rule of law at the heart of the accession process. There are a number of concrete ideas that were set out in February, which are being discussed now among the member states in terms of how this is integrated into negotiating frameworks. This includes stronger measures, both positive incentives, but also where there is a lack of progress, negative incentives, if you like, or the principle of reversibility, which has been mentioned in the methodology from February. So if there are problems with implementation of reforms, if there is stagnation, if there is backsliding, we will have more decisive measures, stronger tools in our toolbox to be able to address these issues. There are also other ideas. For example, the idea of mainstreaming anti-corruption work in the negotiations and across all of the chapters that we engage in the accession negotiations with the country will also be an important tool. Now, the plan is clearly for us an integral part of the support to the Balkans on the path to the EU. I mean, this is also, I think, important to underline. And as mentioned, we see good governance as being the foundation for the sustainable economic growth that we want to achieve. We recognise, and this is very clear, I think, in the enlargement package that has been adopted in parallel last week, that there are existing structural weaknesses. There is poor governance. There are problems, and there is, in a number of cases, limited progress in addressing rule of law shortcomings, in tackling corruption. There is still some way to go in terms of improving the track record in this respect. And so this is something that will have to continue very much in parallel to provide that boost to the economic recovery and to enhance resilience. in the region, and not least to a deal with potential future economic shocks, which of course we've seen one most recently with the COVID crisis. We of course also see a number of issues in particular that need to be addressed, and these have been flagged in the economic and investment plan. Functioning of the judiciary, functioning of the court system has been flagged very much. I think we need to see a functioning system of checks and balances, where you have a visibly empowered, an independent, and impartial, and efficient judiciary that ensures that all state institutions abide by the law. Business need legal certainty. They need absence of corruption. We need to see an efficient public administration that delivers quality services to citizens and to business. We need foreign investors to see that there's a level playing field and that their investments will be protected. And this comes out very strongly, I think, not only in the economic and investment plan, but also in the enlargement package. We need to see alignments with EU public procurement rules, and we need to see enhanced transparency and oversight in this field. And this of course, not only for the sound financial management of the significant resources that we as European Union and Commission will be injecting into the region, but of course also in the interests of the economic development and rule of law in the countries themselves in terms of sound public financial management. I can say more about all of this a little later, but just to conclude, I mean, at this stage, I think, you know, in line with this principle of conditionality, which is reflected in the revised enlargement methodology, we need to see progress on the reform priorities, and we see that this is the key to increased funding and investments, including through this IPA 3 proposal, which we call a performance-based instrument. And equally, we see the need to have decisive measures in place where there is stagnation or worse, backsliding. And these measures, as I say, have also been very much set out in this revised enlargement methodology, and I'll come back to this in a moment. But in a nutshell, I mean, what we're talking about here is, I mean, we might call it the 3 R's. Recovery through investments, reforms in parallel to unlock the impact of these investments, and to come back again to this point, the region. I mean, you have to have a regional approach, and this idea of a regional common market, I think, will also be a crucial factor in underpinning the success of this plan.
Thank you, Mr. Jones, for presenting us the package, and it does seem very challenging times for you in the Commission to work in parallel on the revised, on the implementation and putting into place of the revised accession methodology and incorporating its main principles into the IPA 3 and the economic and investment plan. And I'm sure my colleagues will have some comments and ideas on how to move forward with all these challenging plans. But before I give the floor to Milena, I would just like to ask you at this stage to clarify whether the 9 billion euro support at this stage, as you said, since it's not yet final, it's still subject to the final approval of the MFF. Do we talk here about IPA 3 or European Investment Plan solely? Is or how to say, when we talk about Western Balkans, to what extent can we say that these 9 billion are only to economic and investment plan related activities, and the other remaining funds for the other 3 windows that you mentioned? If at this stage, is it possible to, you know, say whether is it at this stage possible to say which numbers are we talking about?
Yes, I mean, there's a limit, of course, because as I said before, the MFF negotiations are ongoing between the co-legislators, and that affects the overall framework in which we'll be operating between 2021 and 2027, but also the individual legal basis. What is clear is that what the Commission has proposed in this exercise is a significant level of support for IPA 3 overall, It's a little bit of a moving target, but the proposal is over 14 billion euros for the entire period, and it's clear that the lion's share of this funding is destined for the Western Balkans. Now, as I mentioned, the framing of the IPA is around these 5 windows. And those 2 windows that I mentioned in particular, there the lion's share is about the economic support, and that's where you get the strong link to the economic and investment plan. But there are other windows where support will be delivered, and I think it's also important to underline one of the big differences between IPA, the proposal for IPA 3, and what we have under IPA 2 is that there are not predefined country envelopes in the way that we had this in the past. So it is a little bit different. The approach is much more performance based, and the final sort of programming, if you like, will have to follow the procedures that will be in place. We'll have to respect these procedures, and will be very much dependent also on the quality of the proposals that are put forward by the countries. And that, of course, will be coupled then at the same time with looking very much at how the criteria and the reforms are being addressed at the same time.
Okay, thank you. Milena, I would like to give the floor to you now.
Okay, I assume I should just make a comment, Sena, since you have not made a specific question. So it's open as a for me to comment on what Mr. Jones has presented and on the economic and investment plan. So I will just give my brief, very brief reaction, and maybe it would be more interesting to later on actually engage in a discussion and have a more interactive exchange. Basically, maybe just to of course start with the positives and with the pluses. First of all, I think this is an extremely welcome novelty in the new enlargement package. Something that definitely builds on the spirit of the new revised enlargement methodology, and the whole idea that actually for the region to actually be able to accede to the European Union, it needs to catch up with the EU in terms of its socio-economic development. And seeing that in the past years the region actually has been lagging more and more behind, this is probably one of the key concerns that the enlargement policy needs to put in its focus, and is already putting in its focus through this newly presented economic and investment plan. It is excellent that the plan is building, let's say that its building blocks are the enablers of development and economic growth. So transport, energy, and especially green energy and renewables, and digital transformation. So basically, in open free market economies, we need to let the private sector grow, and we need to sort of inject the fuel into the private sector through these key enablers and public infrastructure, which is going to be available to all in order to engage in open competition in the market. What is also excellent is the availability of the new guarantee fund, which is going to help boost investor confidence. And I think that for the region, this is probably going to be a huge added value in order to also boost healthy investments, because over the past years we have seen that the region has been quite vulnerable to shady investments and investments coming from, let's say, not particularly democratic parts of the world, which very often come under conditions which are not conducive to the development of good governance and rule of law. So I think that this guarantee fund, which is going to be provided by the EU, will be actually a very important addition to the overall economic and investment plan. I also believe that it is extremely important that the fundamental reform areas, especially rule of law, and now as sort of a new addition lately, increasingly emphasized public administration reform, which is now being put, let's say, on the same level and on the same footing with the rule of law. I think that it is excellent that the plan puts a strong emphasis on these reforms, particularly in terms of ensuring that the money which is going to be put at the region's disposal through this generous plan is actually going to be made sure to not to end up in the pockets of corrupt politicians, but in the pockets of those that actually need it the most, the private sector and the citizens, not literally in their pockets, but figuratively speaking in their pockets. The plan, rightly so, contains a paragraph which speaks about the necessity to protect, of course, the EU funds in the delivery of all the projects, and it puts a very strong and very positive focus on regional cooperation and regional projects. So this is where I would, let's say, stop with all the pluses and the positives, and maybe focus on something that I would not call the negatives, but simply open questions, and I think some issues which probably deserve attention, and perhaps we can have more of a discussion on those issues. I will just make a few points, and I'm sure that Simonida and Georgi will speak much more of these issues. For me, one of the key questions is actually how we're going to ensure that rule of law and public administration reform as fundamentals are actually going to be mainstreamed as requirements in the delivery of this economic and investment package. Somehow in the structure of the document, of course, there is a section on these issues, but it is a little bit let's say structurally disconnected from the actual ideas of implementation of the project, and it is not very clear what will be the mechanisms to ensure that, or actually, to be more precise, it is not fully clear whether the whole delivery of the economic and investment plan is going to be conditioned upon, for example, progress in areas in chapters 23 and 24 in the accession negotiations, and in general in the rule of law reforms. So, for example, whether if Serbia does not deliver on its constitutional reform, or going to negatively affect the implementation of and the disbursements under the economic and investment plan, or whether the connection will be more in the sense that we need to ensure full transparency, zero tolerance for corruption, a strong involvement of external actors and stakeholders in the implementation of these projects and of the entire plan. We had discussions in previous events on this, and we were sometimes even told by stakeholders coming from EU member states that it is essential that the citizens of the region and that the societies of the region can still benefit from investments and from economic convergence, even if rule of law reforms and fundamental reforms are maybe not fully on track, and even if there is some stagnation or even backsliding. So this is one part of the formula. But then the other part of the formula is okay, if we do not necessarily condition the implementation of these big flagship projects and the actual disbursement of funds under this economic and investment plan with these fundamental reforms, how do we ensure, and what will be the mechanisms put in place to make sure that the money actually ends up where it needs to end up? And we have seen research even coming from some EU member states that high levels of corruption can actually mean rechanneling of EU funds into the wrong pockets and into the wrong beneficiaries, to those who are not the intended beneficiaries, to use a euphemism in a way. So for me, this is this is sort of the biggest question that I would like to discuss, and that I'm pretty sure that Simonida and Georgi will want to further expand on. One last question for me would be, whether we already have an idea and some clarity. I know that we do not have country envelopes foreseen, but for me it would be interesting to understand how this new EPA is going to affect, or how is Turkey going to be even included in this new EPA. If we see that 9 billion euros out of a total portfolio of 14.16 billion euros is going to be mainstreamed only for the economic and investment plan for the Western Balkans, which does not include Turkey. This leaves around 5.16 billion euros for all the support going to Turkey, to all the support going towards the first two windows, so institution building, rule of law support, fundamental support, which is something that has sort of been the core of EPA 2. So basically institutional building support. I'm not fully clear whether we will have a multi-country EPA as a separate portfolio anymore. I would assume that the multi-country EPA would sort of fall under this economic and investment plan, considering its strongly regional focus. And also, where would the sectoral budget support fall? So is sectoral budget support still going to be available through the first two windows? And how relevant is then, and how much money is going to be available for sectoral budget support, because we know that these are also quite important conditionality mechanisms which take place and which the EU applies through sectoral budget support, which, just for our listeners, basically means that the EU offers direct budget support for the reforms in a specific sector. So upon the actual implementation and delivery of reforms and the specific strategic objectives and indicators in a specific sectoral policy, the EU provides a beneficiary country with direct budget support. So these are some of the questions which I have. I don't know if answers are already available for all of these questions, but for me this would be quite interesting. And yeah, maybe, there are many other questions we can discuss later on in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Milena, for raising these questions. So in a nutshell, how to ensure that the funding ends up to the right beneficiaries, and how to make sure that the rule of law and power are rightly mainstreamed as requirements, and whether the conditionality for the economic and investment plan would be the same or would reflect on the same conditionality within the accession negotiations, or whether some other separate conditions would be made. And then another one more time, the question on the allocation of different and the place of different aspects of EPA within this overall budget, if we have any answers to it already now, or if it's still an open question. Simonida, I'll turn to you now. Many hows already. I assume you also have many insights and comments and open new questions on your mind based on the previous two interventions.
Thank you, Sena, and thanks for the invitation. I'll try to be brief because we don't, just to leave time for comments, because we have a lot of participants. In my view, the economic investment plan is likely to bring a more human face of the EU accession to the region. And I think this is the one added value that we should not forget, that it aims to deal, or it aims to bring the benefits of the accession prospects of the region as a more tangible dimension also to the ordinary citizens, because all of the flagship initiatives that are mentioned at the end of the day should contribute to a better life in the region, and hopefully quicker or better economic and social convergence, as was mentioned. And I think with the pandemic, the gap that we inevitably have in terms of lagging behind the European Union average has a risk to be broadened. So that's why I think that this was a very pressing moment, having in mind that a lot of our colleagues from the think tank community have also for years advocated for a bigger investment package in terms of grants, not loans, from the European Union to the region in order to assist catching up, given that the region is anyway already economically very connected to the European Union. So I mean, in my view, this is where I hope to see that in 7 or in 8 years, we will be talking about an error gap to which this plan has contributed. Now, in terms of the key dilemmas that arise in terms of the future implementation, and I think that going back to Milena's question, I know that the modalities cannot be determined at this phase already, because the plan also sets a vision, and the implementation will be also highly dependent on the push from the Commission and from the EU broader institutions, but also from the response of the national administrations and from the national, because at the end of the day, the implementation of the big regional projects will also be dependent here. And I was very glad to hear that one of the key windows was the administrative capacity, because what we've seen, if we take a look back at our experience from previous implementation of previous assessments, I think that this is one of the key elements that we need to see strengthened, but also in terms of building the regional dimension, or building the regional cooperation between the administrations in order to be able to move such big projects forward. Now, going back to this, linked to this discussion of the regional vision of the plan, and the issue of competitiveness that was previously mentioned, also decreasing the importance or the scale of the national envelopes. One of the questions that arises, let's say, in when you think about the actual implementation, is what if we have certain countries advancing and some don't? What if we have certain countries in which certain modalities of the reversibility or certain sanctions are to be implemented? How do we go on with the regional projects and the regional dimension? Because I think that this is on the one hand a very good carrot for all the countries to move forward, but in terms of non-compliance, we can easily imagine a situation of such a situation in this case. Now, in terms of the regional dimension, and also in terms of the regional discussions on the regional market and so on, my only coming from where I am, or Skopje, what is now North Macedonia, the dilemma that we have at certain points is also to that the push for the regional integration in terms of the economic area needs to push for higher standards in terms of pushing us forward to the EU accession, because in some of these areas the country has already implemented very part of the EU legislation, such as, for example, food safety and so on and so forth. And the only concern that we hear sometimes also from my colleagues from the administration is that we need to use these mechanisms to push us forward to the ultimately to the EU accession as such. The fourth point that I have is on the rule of law. I think that Milena raised a lot of these points as to how will these topics be mainstreamed, and she had a specific question on this. I would only here mention that it would be beneficial if these discussions are also linked to the discussions in terms of sanctioning rule of law and use of EU funds within the Union, because I think that it's way easier from a candidate's perspective, also on the side of the European Union officials, when there are clear rules in the European Union for such violations. And I think it helps us as let's say, I would not say promoters, but supporters of European integration. And also when explaining to the public, it does help us when the discussions as to why is certain behavior being sanctioned, if it's linked to the EU accession process, to rules existing for the EU member states as such at this point. We do see, I mean, for us, also coming from where I am, we do see the renewed methodology as a hope. We have to see the glasses half full. But I think it's and it would be amiss from my point also not to mention that it's quite sad to see at this point also the negotiating frameworks and the adoption of the Macedonian negotiating framework being burdened with other bilateral issues from the candidate, from the member states of the EU, rather than discussing matters such as rule of law and reversibility. But as we hear that there are topics under discussion, this is a slight diversion from the topic that we have, but I think from where I stand, I had to make it. The last point that I would like to mention is that the key objective that I see with this plan is to bring back the EU support to supporting the building of EU member states, because I think this is, and I hope that most of these flagships will also be implemented with rules as close as possible to the structural and cohesion funds, so that they actually build up the administration at home in view of what is to follow of their role as an administration of likely to be an EU member state in our lifetime. And I will end it up here for this point. Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Simonida, for your constructive input, suggestions, and for opening up the new questions. I'll emphasize the one on how to ensure the implementation of the regional projects when the countries find themselves, the candidate countries find themselves at different stages of performance in terms of rule of law and administrative capacities. And the other one, the idea to reflect the ongoing negotiations on safeguarding the EU budget and linking it to the rule of law, with also to use these solutions as a mechanism within this European Economic Investment Plan and EPA 3 overall. As well as to reflect all the mechanism used in the implementation of EU structural funds in the EU candidate countries with the view and in line with the expectations that eventually they would become one day the EU member states. Georgi, I'll turn to you now. We opened up many questions and probably many others are still subject to consideration. What is your main
Georgi, I think we lost Sena for a moment, so maybe you can.
Yes. Okay. I wasn't sure whether we lost Sena or you guys lost me. But anyway, thank you, Sena. Well, I think I will follow the same pattern as my two colleagues. Although most of the whys the plan raises were already, let's say, stated. But let me start with the positive ones. Again, most of the positive sides of the plan were also stated, but I'll try to add a few. I think the plan, one of the most important points and initiatives that the plan has, in my opinion, is the focus on the research and development coming from Albania, which is a country that has traditionally scored very low on its preparedness on research and development. I'm very pleased to see such focus of the plan on this area. Another important focus for the lives of the citizens is also the green economy, the focus to address air pollution, waste management and waste treatment challenges and projects in the region, which are projects that will be very challenging to be implemented. In fact, many of us know that in some of our countries we have already investments that have raised serious allegation of corruption. Some of those investments we will have to undo now, which is a good news. The bad news is that for some of those investments that we will have to undo, we have already paid the price. be it in corruption, be it in public finances, be it in state budget being used for those funds, and certainly the funds that have been misused also by illegitimate networks of power. The plan, lastly, the plan, I think, completes the puzzle. It is a step that has been, as my colleagues mentioned, has been urged by many think tankers and by many civil society and other stakeholders in the region, also in view of the increased pressure and presence by other forces and other states in the region. I'm referring to China, but also the presence and the influence coming from Russia and other sources that offer support, including finances with no strings attached. We have long asked and urged EU member states to prepare a more solid answer to this challenge. The economic and investment plans is part of that reply, but I think it's only part of it, and more needs to be done in order to complete the puzzle also in other areas, and more specifically in the area of in the policy of enlargement itself. Now, regarding the plan of investment and that was presented by Mr. Jones, I will add few last hows that maybe it's a bit too soon to have specific and detailed answer to those hows. But I think it's worth bringing to the attention of the audience and also to the attention of the European Commission and EU institutions. The last point that Simonida made on applying the rules, hopefully, of structural funds raises another issue in the region. We know that the region has not best performed in terms of the absorption capacities of EU funds. We have some front runners, of course, like Serbia or like other countries, but we have in most of the countries we face serious issues with the absorption capacity. So I would wonder, how does the plan plan to address this challenge for us? The second how is the role of civil society. There was only once or twice mentioned civil society, but I didn't see a more, let's say, more solid approach towards the civil society in the region, and how does the plan intends to include civil society in the different stages of the implementation of the plan, starting with the elaboration of how the plan itself will be implemented. Lastly, what I would also ask Mr. Jones maybe to give his views is the monitoring benchmarks and the monitoring system of the implementation of the plan. This is something that maybe we shouldn't expect to be elaborated in detail in the plan, but maybe some inside information, hopefully, on how does that how will the approach of the Commission and other structures involved in the design and in the implementation of this plan work towards that. I think I will stop here, and hopefully I was the briefest one.
Thank you. You were all very up to the point. Before giving the floor to Mr. Jones to comment on the reactions of my colleagues, just to briefly wrap up what Georgi emphasized. So the question of absorption capacities of the candidate countries and how to address very weak levels, and whether the new instruments take into account this weakness of the countries. Then, of course, the role of civil society in different stages of the implementation of the financial instruments, the ways in which the instruments could be monitored, if there's a possibility to provide any broad answer at this stage, and comment on whether the new mechanisms could act as a deterrent, let's say, to the problematic investments made by third actors to the region. Mr. Jones, could you please give your comments and reactions to what we raised? Many issues. I assume that many things are very much work in progress still, but we're happy to engage into discussion and crafting of some of the ideas, how to make the best of the plans.
Yeah. No, thanks. Thanks very much to you and all the others, and the strong interest in the questions. No, I mean, maybe just a few remarks. I mean, first, just to really reiterate, this economic and investment plan cannot be seen in isolation from the broader policy framework that we have when it comes to the accession process. I mean, this is really very important, either from the political point of view, from the technical point of view, or the financial point of view. And with that, I mean, again, the idea of the fundamentals first, the idea of the need for good governance being at the heart of the accession process is equally at the heart of the implementation of the plan. The same applies when it comes to the financial assistance. This plan is an integral part of the future instrument for pre-accession assistance. So it is a part of that established framework for providing significant financial support to the region, with the primary objective of helping the countries along the path towards meeting the requirements of EU membership. And that's not easy, of course, as we all well know, and as is well reflected in the individual reports on each of the countries that is part of the enlargement package that was adopted the other week. So now, how conditionality will work? Of course, conditionality is at the heart of what we do. It's also manifested in many different ways. If you look just at let's say how EPA is decided, or how it'll be decided, as I mentioned in my introductory remarks, this will be very much set out in the new regulations, still to be finalized. But I think we have a good idea about how we would like this to look. And clearly, we've made the proposal for this regulation, which is currently being discussed by the co-legislators. So, I mean, here it's clear, the actions that we will select, they will be based on the policy relevance. On the alignment with the programming framework, we will have a programming framework covering the whole period. This still needs to be elaborated. That will be one of the most important first steps once the agreements are all in place, and there will be specific recommendations, of course, of the enlargement package, which will need to be reflected there. There will be a need for looking at the technical maturity of projects, and for this, of course, the capacity to prepare on the part of the partner countries will be absolutely critical, of critical importance. And I think that's something that we will also, and I think this is flagged in the economic and investment plan, want to provide substantial support towards. And then when it comes to looking on the actions and what is put forward through the programming process for each of the thematic priorities, we will be looking very much at how the reforms are being implemented on the ground. And again, the reforms that are precisely linked to ensuring the sound financial management of the investments that we want to inject into the economy, ensuring that the public administration is properly functioning, ensuring that the public procurement systems are improving, ensuring that the anti-corruption framework more broadly is in place and is delivering. So this is all part and parcel of this. And these control mechanisms, of course, we have this through the IPA process. But again, one of the objectives, again, going back to the revised methodology for the enlargement policy, one of the novelties there, and this is a very important novelty, is that in the context of the accession negotiations, we have now proposed, and this revised methodology has been endorsed by the member states. The detail of it is being integrated into the negotiating frameworks right now. I mean, this is still subject to discussion in the member states. But in essence, we have this idea of, whereas in the past, in the context of the accession negotiations directly, we only had we call them chapters 23 and 24. Chapter 23 covers judiciary, corruption, fundamental rights. Chapter 24 is justice, freedom, security, covering migration, organized crime, police cooperation, these sorts of things. Those two chapters were an integral part of the process, and it was very clear that the work on those chapters was being prioritized, so that this would have to be addressed from the very beginning of the process, addressed all the way throughout, and only once sufficient progress was made would the overall process be able to be brought to a conclusion. We have now put into the mix the idea that public administration reform, including public financial management, now becomes an integral part of the accession negotiations. And this was never the case before. So this is a novelty, and this is precisely because we see, I mean, there are direct links between what we do in terms of rule of law support, what we do in terms of the functioning of the public administration, and what counts in terms of the business environment that will unlock the possibility for productive investment leading to growth and job creation. So we see a direct links between all of this, and that's why we've put forward proposals to integrate this in a much better and coherent way. Now there were questions about the multi-country support, the regional dimension, Turkey, how much money would be left, and all the rest of it. I mean, Turkey is an interesting example because already, we want IPA 3 to be a much stronger performance-related and policy-directed instrument. If you look at what's happened under IPA 2, and the case of Turkey, it's very clear that Turkey has been moving away from the European Union for some time. If you look at the report on Turkey that's just been published last week, I mean, it's a sobering assessment of the problems that exist in many fields, in particular around what we call the political criteria. So read for this: rule of law, democracy, fundamental rights, and so on. And that has had, over the last few years, that these problems and the backsliding that we've identified has had a direct impact on the financial assistance that's been available for Turkey through IPA. So there has been a big reduction. But what's important to also underline, and I think this is also the idea going forward, and will apply to the Western Balkans, where there is stagnation and backsliding, and where it is then deemed necessary to adjust the level of funding, and this is a real possibility, of course, if such circumstances arise. We would, as we've seen in the case of Turkey, want to be sure that support is still available to help civil society, to help democratic reforms, to help with rule of law support, and so on. So this is important to underline, and I think also in the economic and investment plan, it's been made very clear that the level of support in these fields will continue, as has been the case up until now. Now, on the regional dimension, I think we see this as being very, really very, very important. And there are a number of ideas set out in the economic and investment plan. We hope that this will also lead to important decisions to be taken at the summit, the Western Balkans summit, that will take place in the context of the so-called Berlin process, which will take place, I think it's scheduled for the 10th of November in Sofia, where there will be a discussion precisely on this dimension, on the idea of a regional common market. I think we've quoted in the plan, a study by the World Bank which estimates, that if this common market really works, based on EU rules, and this is very important, it has to be based on EU rules. It could have a boost of up to 6.7% of GDP for the region. I mean, this is not insignificant. And again, the idea of accelerating integration and alignment with EU rules is very much at the heart of everything we're doing. So this support for this regional common market is very much about a stepping stone towards the European Union. It's not a detour on the path towards the European Union. And we have also this idea, of course, the countries are at different stages. I mean, this is very evident, whether on the political criteria, whether on rule of law, functioning of public administration. You see quite some variation. It also applies, when you start to look at the let's say the economic chapters of the acquis, when you look at different aspects of the internal market. But this is also why what we want to do is, through the revised enlargement methodology, to try to identify areas where it's in the common interest of the countries of the region and also of the European Union to accelerate alignment, and through that unlock the key to accelerated integration. Because what we want, and there are questions also about structural funds and how to prepare the countries. Across the board, our objective is very much to increasingly treat the countries of the Western Balkans, as future member states. And I think we've seen this in the context of the COVID pandemic and response, where we have cooperated with the Western Balkans in a way that we've never cooperated before, and certainly we don't cooperate with anybody else. I mean, as clearly as future member states, but not just in this context. I think we have this broader objective of involving them much more in our policies much earlier, to accelerate the alignment and allow tighter integration sooner rather than later. Other points. I mean, absorption capacity is always an issue, but I think here, there's a recognition that, of course, there's a need for grant support. There's also the question of debt levels. The macroeconomic indicators are not always favorable in that respect. And I think this is where we are bringing important value, but also, and this coming back to the idea of the guarantee, what this plan is also trying to achieve is it's trying to improve the business and investment environment precisely to generate more interest in the region from the private sector. Certainly the regional common market, and the idea is here, this will put the region on the map. Currently it's not a highly integrated market. And it's not necessarily seen by investors as being really interesting to invest in Serbia, because you then are able to then basically also access very easily the Albanian market, or vice versa. This is not currently the case, but I think through these efforts that are ongoing, we can move very much in this direction. And then by unlocking through guarantees the possibility for incentivizing investors who are dipping their toes in the water, so to speak, I think will also play an important role.
Thank you very much, Mr. Jones, for responding to these open questions. Last but not the least, we have a partner from the Netherlands, the Clingendael Institute, very valuable partner in instigating the debates between the member states and the stakeholders from the region, especially the civil society. Wouter, what's your take on the entire discussion and on the plan? And could you give us a bit of more insights on your anticipation, let's say, of the position of the Dutch stakeholders about the entire topic of our event, and in general your own view based on your expertise and your fields of interest within Clingendael?
Yes, of course. Thank you, Sena, and thanks also to all the other speakers for the intriguing contributions, and especially, of course, to the informative presentation of Mr. Jones, who has really tried to answer all our critical questions already. I'll try to be short because some of my comments will be in line with what has already been said, and we want to allow for some discussion and questions from the audience as well, of course. First, I think the economic investment plan is very important also for the credibility of the EU. We've discussed it implicitly already, but not explicitly, but I think it shows that the EU is really willing to engage with the region beyond merely setting these difficult reform criteria. And of course, to be credible, one should not only focus on difficult reforms, but also be engaged. And this plan is a sign of that, as has already been discussed. But I would just like to add that I think that not only the EU institutions need to be engaged, but also the member states in the EU, because in the end, I think EU enlargement as a whole can only function if the Western Balkans countries and the member states also become closer to each other, and that also the EU member states take an interest in the region. And I think it's not yet fully articulated in this communication how also the EU member states can connect to initiatives in the context of this economic investment plan. Because as Mr. Jones said, I think it should not only be the European Commission objective to treat the countries in the Western Balkans as future member states, but we would also need to see the member states, the current EU member states, doing so. So then shortly on the economic need for this plan, I think economically the plan is very welcome. As already discussed, there is a convergence issue, and I was reading some articles in the past week and found an article by The Economist in 2018, and that noted that the distance between the average income in the Western Balkans and the countries that made up the EU in 1989, so the EU 15, was bigger in 2017 than in 1989. So in any case, in terms of income levels, we've actually seen a divergence in that period, and that's of course a major problem. And then I also stumbled across a publication by the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and it said that in a report from 2018, which presented a number of scenarios for this converging of the Western Balkans with the rest of the EU. And the most pessimistic scenario provided was one in which it would take the Western Balkans up to 200 years to converge. Well, frankly speaking, I don't really have 200 years, and I don't think many others will. So I think also in that regard, it shows that these investments are well needed, and the economic investment plan is a major step in that direction. I do have a question whether I do question a bit whether this will be enough. I mean, the instrument for pre-accession funds, including this economic investment plan, are still outweighed by also the cohesion funds within the EU, which means that basically the EU member states will continue to receive more funds than the countries in the Western Balkans. And I'm just wondering what effect that will have on convergence. Of course, we've also already discuss the absorption capacity problem in that regard, but it's good to see that there's also ample attention to that in the European Commission plan to also support the countries in the Western Balkans with absorbing these kind of funds. And then lastly, I wanted to say something about geopolitics as well. Clingendael organized a webinar also last week on whether the presence of China in the Western Balkans undermines EU interests, and that was based on a report we wrote at Clingendael. And I think for us it is not really surprising that the countries in the Western Balkans continue to seek economic benefits also from their relation with China. I mean, especially given this fact that they really need to catch up economically, that's quite logical. But what became very clear from our study is that these engagements with China and maybe also investors from other parts of the world often undermine EU interests because they are based on a substantially different set of values. You know, China basically represents a whole different model of statehood, and it's very important that the EU make sure that it stays ahead basically in its relations with the Western Balkans. And I think one important way to do so is what we also identified in the report, is to be responsive to the economic needs of the Western and Balkan countries. And I think this economic investment plan searches to do exactly that. Then lastly, I had some questions about conditionality as well, but we already discussed those mostly. So I'd just like to come back to your point on the Dutch stakeholders and how the Dutch would see it as well. I think this is also still an open question. I mean, our government will still discuss this with our parliament. And I think there will be much attention, as always, to rule of law and to conditionality in this debate. Of course, yeah. So basically, this is really an open question, and we'll need to see how that debate goes also in the Netherlands and in other member states.
Thank you, Wouter, for pointing the role of the member states in the protest and their engagement, the necessity to engage them as the bearers and the main decision makers in the enlargement policy. And I found one interesting paragraph in European Investment Plan, which says that it's in EU's strategic interest to invest and engage in this endeavor with the Western Balkans in a way to as a method to resolve or to contribute to resolving the supply chains problem for the EU, and in that way to enhance its strategic autonomy. So that might be one of the ways to a good argument for the member states as well. Okay, we have some 15 minutes for the discussion with the audience. So far we've had the 3 questions written in our Q&A chat. Most of them are directed to Mr. Jones. One by Robert Bosch, which says and asks, how do the flagships 1 to 3 on transport in the investment plan relate to similar activities financed by both China and by the US? And he gives the plan of a Grenell plan for Kosovo and Serbia. Then there's a question on to Milena Lazarevic and to Alan Jones on poverty reduction and the question on healthcare sector. It says that does the EU also intend to reduce poverty and support the healthcare sector, or does it rely on the market and national governments to overcome these issues? Yeah, and for Milena specifically, whether she agrees that poverty reduction and the development of functioning of health sector should be on the EU's agenda. And finally, the third question to, there's one more in the meantime. The third question to Mr. Jones is whether there are any specific accountability measures envisioned by the economic investment plan besides the conditionality policy. And the comment, since the conditionality policy has largely failed to prevent the concentration of power and autocracy in the Western Balkans, do you think it's prudent to expect that conditionality will prevent potential diversion of funds and corruption stemming from the implementation of the EIP project? So again, Alban, our colleague, raised the concern of whether, how to ensure that the autocrats do not solely benefit and their networks of the funds. Andre de Mutter from European Parliament has a comment, and I'll finish with that. It says the 28-page economic investment plan cruelly lacks specificity in terms of how to actually enforce things. Rule of law, he says, has 7 vague references, oversight 1 mention, conditionality only 1 occurrence, no mention of parliamentary oversight. By the way, I regret there is no representative of the European plan on the European Parliament of the panel. Milena is 500% right about money ending up in pockets. We have all seen in yesterday's champagne and all smiles pictures in Belgrade with Vucic, Dodik, and Čović. So this is the plan. This is the comment from Andre de Mutter. And last, for Mr. Jones, the question about the Western Balkans Guarantee Facility. The question is how it will work in practice. How did you come up with the sum of 20 billion euros? Is this sum to be consisted of loans? Many questions. I hope you managed to grasp them all, Mr. Jones, so I might give you the floor first to respond to them.
Thank you. No, thank you for the further remarks and questions. No, maybe, I mean, just maybe starting with the guarantee, the last question first. You know, the idea here is that what we would provide under EPA 3 is certain provisioning to make these guarantees available, which would allow guarantees. You know, for example, I think if you have something like a billion euros of provisioning, you can generate then this for guarantees worth, let's say, 4 or 5 billion euros. And then this can unlock investments which would then have a multiplier effect to a level of perhaps up to 20 billion euros. I mean, this is the sort of thinking behind it. Now, what type of provisioning you need, it depends on, you know, what type of investments you'd be supporting, because the guarantee would be supporting private sector investment, but also public sector investment. So this would work on both fronts, and the level of risk will vary depending on the nature of the investment that we are seeking to guarantee. So this is an estimate of what we could be looking at based on a balance between the private and public sector investments. Now, they're talking about investments and how this would work in practice. Also, the questions about the involvement of member states and others. I think it's important to underline that, you know, we have a structure in place, this Western Balkans investment framework, and that includes a private sector platform known as the Western Balkans Enterprise Development and Innovation Facility. You know, and these are frameworks or platforms that bring together Western Balkans partners, bilateral donors, international financial institutions, and we see this as being the main vehicle to ensure the swift deployment of the investment package, which is a part, the core of this plan, precisely then to support all of these measures that we've mentioned in terms of the infrastructure links, supporting the dual green digital transition, boosting private sector competitiveness, etc. Now, another issue that I didn't answer, actually, I think Georgi raised this, and this is, I want to come back to that point. This is on the research and development angle. The countries of the Western Balkans are already, you know, participating in the Horizon 2020 and in the research activities of the European Union, but the level of the capacity varies between the countries. The level of engagement varies too, and I think this is an area where we see scope to ensure a closer cooperation and integration. So one thing that's been announced in this economic and investment plan, it's not fully articulated on the table yet, but this will come in the not too distant future, is what we will be calling an innovation agenda for the Western Balkans, precisely to boost technology transfer, facilitate access to this world-class research infrastructure that we have in the European Union, and to increase the scope for cooperation and realization of the possibilities that exist in this field. Now, another area that I didn't go into so much, but this was raised in one of the questions there in the chat, is on supporting poverty reduction and the health system. I think this is an area, the poverty reduction clearly is one of the main objectives of the overall exercise. And support in the socio-economic sector, in the social field, in particular education and health, is coming very much to the fore in this plan. And this was already something that was flagged with this Western Balkan strategy 2 years ago, and I think the need has only been accelerated and highlighted even more by the COVID situation. So I think here you will see more activity precisely in these fields, which of course play an important role also in the prospects for further economic development. The question on the projects, how will this work with other actors and so on? Of course, what we have on the table here at this stage, the projects that you see, this is in a way a first package of projects. They're based on outreach to the countries, to the partners, in terms of the ideas that they have to put forward. And we have tried to sort of bring into this first package, if you like, precisely those projects where there are prospects of moving them forward substantially during the course of the mandate of the current Commission. Of course, these are projects which will be going through, as I say, this coordination structure, the platform that we have in place, and we hope will be able to come to fruition in a reasonable time frame. Of course, other players are out there. This is clear. I understand indeed that there was an event last week discussing the role of other third country players in the region. I think it's important to underline that there's nothing wrong with other players being interested in investing in the economies of the Western Balkans, and done in the right way, undoubtedly, this will have an important role to play and an important contribution in economic development. I think where we are cautious is to pay attention to the risks associated with certain investments, given the EU accession path that the region is on. And given the importance of ensuring that these projects are implemented, designed and taken forward and implemented in line with EU rules, which is the ultimate destination for the region. So when this comes to ensuring proper transparency requirements, when this comes to ensuring that public procurement rules are properly respected, when this comes to ensuring that social standards are properly respected, when this comes to ensuring the environmental standards are properly respected. I mean, these are some examples, but these, I think, are the things that we need to pay particular attention to. And then maybe finally, the issue of economic convergence. Of course, there are. It's an interesting point. I mean, indeed, I mean, this is the tragedy in a way of recent history, that comparing the situation in 1989 and the situation now between the Western Balkans and the rest of what is now the European Union, is of course a sobering analysis. But what we have seen is clearly, over the recent years, very important progress in the post-conflict transition. I mean, this not been easy, but there has been, taking a step back and looking at where the region is now compared to where it was 10, 15, 20 years ago. Clearly, there's been very, very important progress. Now, we want to see that this convergence is further, that this is accelerated. And we are trying to put in place mechanisms to support this beyond the economic and investment plan. So you will know that one of the, there are the famous Copenhagen criteria for joining the European Union. And we're very often talking about the political criteria, and a lot of this discussion that we've been engaged in now has been around the rule of law, public administration, functioning of democratic institutions, all this type of thing. But we also have the economic criteria, and where the Balkans differ, let's say, to the situation in the 2004 enlargement, the fifth enlargement, is that as things currently stand, none of the Western Balkans, according to the economic criteria, are defined as functioning market economies. And certainly none of the countries in our assessment would be ready to withstand the competitive pressures of the EU's internal market, which is the other part of the economic, the Copenhagen economic criteria. So here too, I mean, we are moving in this direction of further strengthening the process of analyzing the economic reforms. We have this economic reform program process, which is also mirroring to a large extent what we do within the European Union in the context of the European semester. And also this is addressing increasingly the social dimension as well. And I think this will play an important role in building the foundation to allow that accelerated convergence. And I think we should also, as a final remark, I mean, this applies across the board, we should not, forget that the responsibility ultimately lies in the hands of the countries of the Western Balkans. It's not for the European Union to dictate exactly how things will be done or to do all of that work for the region. We can facilitate, we can support, we can provide the right framework, and that's precisely what we're trying to do, injecting momentum into the process with the latest proposals that we've put on the table. But ultimately, it will only work if the countries of the region, if the political leaders in the region take the responsibility for the reform processes, and do it not just because of wanting to meet the criteria for joining the European Union, but in the interests of the proper development of the countries of the region, and in the interests of the citizens themselves.
Many thanks, Mr. Jones, for addressing practically all of the questions raised. There were for sure many. For the end, I'd like to give the word to all of you, concluding remarks for the end. Let's start maybe in the reversed way. Wouter, then Georgi, then Simonida, then Milena. And Mr. Jones, for the end, if I could ask you, there's one thing that you might have overlooked to respond, and that's the role of the civil society in monitoring the implementation of the entire funding. Whether if you have any input on that, we would really appreciate as the members of the civil society with particular interest in that respect. So concluding remarks, Wouter, do you have any anything you would like to raise that hasn't been mentioned yet for the end?
Yes, thank you, Sena. And I think a lot has been said already, and the contribution of Mr. Jones has been extremely informative. Of course, he is very right that At some point, it's also up to the countries in the region itself to and their governments, especially, to show also they're serious about EU enlargement and also engaging in difficult reforms. And unfortunately, so of course, in some of the country reports in the enlargement package, we've seen well, limited progress in that regard. So also my comments the comments that I made also on geopolitics. I mean, of course, I think countries need to be free to also develop their relations with China, and the EU should not really be hypocritical in that regard, because of course we also see EU member states that seek to benefit from their relations with China economically. But I think Mr. Jones is also right that at some point the countries in the Western Balkans, and especially the ones that have been lagging a bit, need to move forward also with these more difficult reforms again. But let me not end on that note. Let me just end on the note that I think well, this economic investment plan is extremely important to create this momentum, and I'm really looking forward to see how things will evolve in the months to come.
Thank you, Georgi.
On this last point that Wouter mentioned, I think might have been much easier for the Western Balkan countries if we had a sort of framework of, or a commonly agreed framework within the EU for the cooperation with China. But since the examples coming from EU member states are very different, then it's no wonder that we see such different instances of dependency, or even taking advantage of one option versus the other.
Fully agree.
As regards the final note, I mentioned in the beginning that the economic and investment plans complete the puzzle. However, I feel that this is not the end of the story. Okay, the EU offered finally what many of us urged here. However, the EU has yet to answer to another question. With these economic and investment plans, EU offers an option. Alternatives are different though. China is offering funding with no strings attached, that are very, preferred on the side of governments that are in the region that are not so keen to rule of law and democratic standards. The only player that is actually 100% in favor of economic support and investments with strings attached, that is coming from the EU, and the strings attached are democratic standards and rule of law, are the people in the region. And this is where the EU needs to look at while trying to find the answer to that last questions. We have money, we can support your economic development, your economic convergence with the EU, but you have to, also perform good in relation to rule of law and democratic standards. And for this to happen, of course, the EU needs also to look back home. Some of its members are offering a bad example for us, or are offering a justification for some of our rulers in the region. So yeah, that would be all on my side. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Georgi. Simonida, your concluding remarks.
Thanks, Anna. Georgi inspired me how to make things easier. He started with, it would be easier for the Western Balkans if we had a common stance on the investment from China, but it would be easier for the EU institutions and overall EU member states to also support the implementation of the economic and investment plan if all of the countries were also engaged in some meaningful negotiations process. Because if they also end in sight, at least, as I say, for some foreseeable future in the EU accession process, then the whole investment plan and its regional dimension, going back to where I started, would be much more easier and much more meaningful. What I didn't mention before is that whereas we are very appreciative of the new methodology, I don't think that in the previous approach also, I don't think that the EU lacked instruments, and sanctioning was always an option on the table. It's even enshrined it's a basic principles in the SAA, needless to go further. So I think that no instrument or new methodology will actually supplement the moment of political will on the side of all EU member states as well to engage in a sanctioning exercise when we go to rule of law conditionality. It's only that at the end of the day, at some points, we did trade some forms of stability or support in the refugee/migration crisis for some other aspects that were more important at a certain time. So I hope that rule of law will actually prevail down the road in implementing the plan to benefit us all, both the EU member states and the region.
Since I think Sena has frozen, I will just briefly end with my final remark, just completely building on what my colleagues before me have reiterated, and especially on what Georgi reiterated in relation to what the citizens from the region are asking for. And I think that the civil society in the region is a very good mirror of those requests coming from our societies. So in that sense, I would just like to reiterate that on the one hand, yes, it would be amazing to actually have an even more generous support and investment and economic plan from the EU coming up in the future, that these 9 billion euros actually turn into something even bigger and more resembling of the actual structural funds of the EU. Which would make them more politically relevant and, let's say, difficult to ignore by the political elites in the region. But at the same time, I think that the implementation of IPA 2 offers us ample space to learn from, let's say, some not so good examples in terms of transparency and possibilities for external monitoring of how the funds were implemented. I think that there is also a big responsibility on the part of the European Commission and the officials, especially higher level officials in the European Commission, to ensure that all the data about the spending, reporting on the spending are available to the public, and that the civil, which would allow the civil society in the region to engage in meaningful monitoring of how this money is spent and where it is ending up. I think that this is both in the interest of the EU itself and of the citizens in the region. I think it is in nobody's interest to just boost spending and disbursements without actually ensuring that the money ends up where it is intended to end up. And I will finish on that note.
Thank you. Mr. Jones, your concluding words.
Thanks very much. No, I mean, just picking up on what Milan has said, I fully agree. I think this is going to be absolutely crucial in terms of ensuring the credibility of this process, and that is, again, that is one of the principles that is very much at the heart of what we're doing, and it's important for credibility in the region, and it's also important for credibility vis-a-vis our member states. You know, our member states are ultimately in charge of all of this, and it's precisely the member states who are very much interested in seeing the process works, that the process delivers and achieves what it aims out to achieve, and it can only do that if it is a credible process. We've wanted to increase transparency in how things are done, and this applies at all levels. I mean, this is about the assistance, but this is also about the overall process in terms of raising awareness and understanding that the process is complicated. I mean, joining a club like the European Union is not a walk in the park. It is a complicated, complex, multifaceted exercise involving all stakeholders in a country. It is a difficult journey, and that's where I think civil society, to come to the point about civil society, play an absolutely crucial role. And I think this is something that we have recognized in the past, and I think it's something that we recognize now, and we see it as being extremely important going forward as well. In the, our support for civil society, takes different dimensions. We have, of course, financial support that is available to help civil society, but there's also the political support. And I think you'll see, if you look in the annual reports of the enlargement package, I think there, we are also trying to raise awareness to the challenges that civil society is facing. I think we see, there is still some way to go in terms of improving the enabling environment in the countries. This is also a political issue that is of importance, and I think this is something that we are flagging and something we are working on. I think the involvement of civil society in this overall process needs to be further encouraged. It's something that is very important in the context of the accession negotiations, and this is something that of course, for Serbia and Montenegro, accession negotiations are already ongoing. It was very important in that context to have civil society involved in the structures in the countries for how, on the side of the candidate country, the process is being managed. I think this is something that we are very keen to see further strengthened, and in particular looking ahead to the negotiations with Albania and with North Macedonia. I think this would be absolutely crucial, again, for the overall credibility of the process, to be sure that the scrutiny is there, that all stakeholders' views are taken into account, and that this is understood. It's a whole of society exercise and
Yes.
has to involve all stakeholders. So I think this is something that we'll be very much keen on. And that's why also I think to allow this scrutiny, we are trying to increase this transparency. We've tried it in this package this year. We've tried to be clearer in our assessments. They're very long documents, but of course, by their very nature, they have to be to cover all of the ground, and precisely to address this transparency point, so that the civil society can see, what is the assessment, what are the issues, and use this in the dialogue with the authorities. So that's it. Thank you very much from my side. I think it's been a very interesting event, and thanks very much to everyone for the questions and the interest.
Thank you very much for providing us more insight into the plans and documents. I think we will all come up with better informed about what's at the plate at the moment, and we as civil society do really look forward in staying engaged with you in crafting future both options and possibly solutions to all the open questions that there are still. And there are quite some within both the financial assistance instruments and in the framework of the new methodology and enlargement package in general. Dear audience, thank you very much for being engaged and for following us. Please continue to follow our work. We will stay engaged, and we will in the future, of course, instigate more dialogue and discussion with different stakeholders at the Western Balkans at the EU level. And many thanks again for our partners from Clingendael as well. Until the next occasion, goodbye.
Goodbye.
Thank you, Sena. Goodbye.
Thank you.